Welcome to the new Workology Go Podcast. In just under 5 minutes, we'll get you the HR and workplace news you need before you start your day 2 times a week. Get ready, get set, and go with the new Workology Go Podcast.
Here are today's HR and workplace news headlines from the Workology Go Podcast. I'm Jessica Miller-Merrill. This podcast is sponsored by HSA Bank. Gallup has found that more than one-third, that's 36% of U.S. workers are in the gig economy, which works out to a very large number of approximately 57 million people. I'm a member of the gig economy, and I can tell you, as a gig worker, it is growing like crazy. And because this area of contractor and self-employment is growing, our labor laws aren't keeping up, and a growing number of gig workers are filing unemployment, unfair labor practices, and EEOC claims. Today's featured story is from the Employers Council, and it's titled, Door-to-Door Unionization at the NLRB Slammed Shut to Uber Drivers. The NLRB issued a memorandum in May of 2019 indicating that Uber drivers are not legal employees for the purpose of federal labor laws. Since they are not legal employees, the National Labor Relations Act and its protections it affords legal employees to unionize don't apply to Uber drivers. Uber drivers can't unionize because they aren't employees, and so they can't file unfair labor practices or participate in unions. I did want to include a portion of a past Workology podcast interview where we talked to attorney Bobby Silverstein. He talks about how the gig economy is changing the workplace and the landscape for employers who are hiring and employing independent contractors through web-based platforms, many of which who have a disability. Traditional employment laws, in this case, don't apply. Bobby talks about if the ADA applies, that's the Americans with Disabilities Act, and Title VII to the gig economy.
Well, there are 3 basic issues or topics that I think folks should be focusing on. The first is whether a business that uses a web-based platform to select gig workers, whether they're acting as employers and whether the individual vendors are considered employees. The second major topic is if these vendors are considered independent contractors and the companies are not considered employers subject to the ADA, whether or not there are other provisions of the ADA that still apply. In other words, if you're not an employer, you're not subject to Title I of the ADA, which deals with employment discrimination. But you may well be subject to Title II of the ADA, which deals with state and local governments, or Title III, which deals with public accommodations, that is, businesses that do business with the public. So the first issue, are you an employer? Is there an employer-employee relationship? If the answer is no, and you're an independent contractor, are you still subject to non-discrimination rules as public accommodations or state and local governments? And the third question is whether those companies that design those web-based platforms are required to make their marketplace accessible to all, including people with disabilities. And so those are the 3 major topics that I think we need to discuss.
And these are interesting topics, and they're fundamentally different than the way we as human resources and recruiting and workplace leaders have operated our departments or our businesses.
Sure. Particularly if the conclusion in a given circumstance is that the business is not operating an employer-employee relationship. And so the question is, if they are an independent contractor, are there still requirements? And that typically does, as you said, go beyond what human resources folks' expertise entails.
You just heard Bobby's interview, and I'm also linking to an article in the podcast transcript that talks about Texas Workforce Commission. And in April of this year, they passed a rule by a 2-to-1 vote that would allow companies like Uber, Lyft, Favor, and Instacart who hire independent workers to not have to pay unemployment taxes and benefits to those contract and gig workers. The gig workforce is changing, and these are 2 examples of many more laws, votes, memorandums, and court decisions that will continue to shape our workforces and address the gig economy as more people than ever take part in gig work, either as a full-time or part-time income supplement. That might be you. Maybe you got a side hustle in HR. Whatever it is, this is a very fast-moving landscape, sure to be changing, and at the Workology Go podcast, we will keep you up to date on changes as we see them coming.
With health savings accounts, flexible spending accounts, health reimbursement arrangements, COBRA, and commuter benefits, HSA Bank is simplifying the health account experience for over 35,000 employers and 2.7 million members alike, inspiring everyone to own their health. Learn more at hsabank.com.
And that's this episode of the Workology Go podcast, sponsored by HSA Bank. We're your go-to for HR and workplace news. I'm Jessica Miller Merrill. Thank you for listening.
To learn more about the Workology Go podcast, subscribe to us on Apple, Google, and Stitcher. Our podcast is also available on Alexa and Google Home. Learn more at workology.com/Go podcast and access this episode's resources, links, and reports for more information.